Hey, everybody, this is a summary of Frederick Douglass's, the narrative of Frederick Douglass, a book about his life that he wrote. This is a summary of chapters 2 through 10. So in chapter 2, Frederick is talking about how he lived on the plantation of Colonel Lloyd. He said that the main crops that were grown on the plantation were tobacco, corn, and wheat. Colonel Lloyd would have 300 to 400 slaves on his plantation at any given time. He talked about slave allowance, like what kind of food that they ate. Each month or each week they got an allotment of cornmeal and fish or pork. Clothing, they usually got one allowance of clothing per year, like a pair of pants, a shirt, 2 pairs of pants or a shirt, supposed to last the whole year. For a bed, for example, they slept on the floor. He talked about how it was a special time sometimes in a slave's life to be invited to the great house to work at the great house, or to be invited to the great house for any specific reason. He came to find out later, or to determine later on in his life, that wasn't something that was so special to him. Chapter 3. He talked about Colonel Lloyd, who was a slave owner who he lived with. He talked about one of the things that Colonel Lloyd was known for was a garden that he had this huge garden that people used to come for miles and miles to come just look at and see all the things that he had there. He said that as a slave, it was very tempting to not eat some of the fruit. And he said that what Colonel Lloyd did was to stop people from eating the fruit. He put a fence around the gardens, and he put tar on the fence. And if you got any of the tar on you, they assumed that you had been eating some of the fruit, and this caused you to get a bad whipping by the overseer. He said there was people who got whipped who accidentally got tar on them, who hadn't even eaten anything. They just got the tar on them. So that was chapter 3. Chapter 4. He talked about there was an overseer named Mr. Gore. He was a gruesome overseer. He believed in whipping the slaves savagely. Believed that slaves should be whipped every week, regardless of whether they did something wrong or not. He ended up shooting a slave. There was one slave who refused to do some work, so he decided to whip him. He refused to let him whip him. This slave ran into the water and jumped into the water. He asked the slave to come out several times. The slave would not. So he told him, if you don't come out, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to shoot you. And he ended up shooting the slave. He was never, he did stand trial for it. He was not convicted of anything. He was, found not guilty, or maybe not even had a trial. Chapter 5. Frederick talks about that he lived on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. He was probably like 8 years old. He got sent to move to Baltimore with a Mr. Hugh Auld. He said this was the first time that he saw a white person smile at him. When he finally arrived to the new Auld's house, he saw the wife and husband standing in the doorway, and they were smiling at him. This surprised him that a white person would actually smile at a black person, and like they were happy to see him. So chapter 6. He said Mrs. Auld was very nice at first. She believed in teaching the slaves to read and write, to be educated. So she started teaching Malcolm to read. She started teaching Frederick to read. And one day her husband came into the room and saw that she was teaching Frederick to read. So he told her that she was to stop doing that immediately and never do that again, because it was illegal. First of all, it was illegal to teach a slave. Second of all, it was bad business to teach a slave or to educate a slave, because he said once you educate a slave, they become unmanageable. They don't need to know anything about anything, basically. He said after this, the wife, who was very nice, became very, very mean and would punish him if she even found him with a newspaper. He said this is where he knew like he had to educate himself because he found out what they were hiding from him, and it was in the education. Chapter 7. Frederick lived in with Master Hughes 7 years, learned how to read. This is where he finally learned how to read. He said how he learned how to read was he had in the neighborhood or where the plantation was, there was other white families that lived in the area who weren't necessarily slave owners, but they were, poorer families and they knew how to read because they were going to school or they had teachers. So he would ask his friends, his white friends, to teach him how to read or how to write. Okay, and he would exchange that for little bits of food that he had in his pockets. He learned about a book called The Columbian Orator. The Columbian Orator, he said, was a life-changing book for him. It was a book about a master and a slave. This is where he said that learning how to read was a blessing and a curse because he said when he was ignorant, when he didn't know how to read, he really didn't know like some of the bad stuff that was really, he didn't know about his condition. But once he learned how to read, he became to understand that he was really in a bad condition. One of the words that he kept coming across was the word abolitionist. And he said he didn't know what the word meant at first, but he came to kind of discover that the word was being used in the context of someone who basically was against slavery or against, they were trying to abolish or trying to get rid of slavery. So he knew that the word was probably a good word that he wanted to learn. He learned how to write. He learned how to write when he was working in a shipyard, he says. That's how he learned how to write. He would copy, what the other guys were writing, and that's where he learned how to write at. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 were kind of short chapters. Chapter 8, he talked about his master, slave master died. And he talked about once his original slave master died, they have what's called a valuation. That means all the master's property was going to be sold, was going to be valued, and is going to be put up for sale. And so he was sold along with all the other slaves and all the property at something called a valuation. And then chapter 10. One of the big events that happened in chapter 10 was Frederick had a fist fight with one of his overseers. He said the overseer had asked him to go work in one of the pens to do some work or whatever. He said when he turned around, the overseer was in the pen with him. He said he saw that the overseer had a rope in his hand and a whip. He didn't know what the guy was going to do at first, but he said eventually the guy swung the rope around his legs, pulled him to the ground. He said at that time he did know what was going on. The guy was planning on giving him a whipping or whatever. He said at that time he decided to fight back. Him and the overseer fought for 2 hours. He says he ended up defeating the overseer. He bloodied him up. And the thing was that this overseer had a reputation of being the master slave breaker. People used to send their slaves to him so that he would break them for them, be like a tough slave, someone who was hard to deal with. They would send their slaves to live with him so that he could break them and then take them back to the original slave owner, and they'd be ready to work without any problems. That was this guy's reputation and where he was around. And Frederick fought this guy and bloodied him and defeated him. He said from that point on, this overseer never whipped him. He was expecting the overseer to take him to the authorities for that, but he said he never did. And the reason why he thought he never took him to the authorities is because this would have ruined his reputation as a slave breaker, to know that there was a slave that stood up to him and did not allow him to whip him and defeated him in a fist fight. This would have broke his reputation. So this was chapter 2 through chapter 10. in the narrative of Frederick Douglas. It's a book about his life from when he was a slave as a child to as an adult when he became free. I will be coming back later with other videos to talk about chapter 11 and beyond. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening.